Goeiemiddag en welkom aan almal wat ingeskakel het by die eerste van ons 4 Zoom gesprekke in die Augustus maand van kuns aangebied deur Welgemeend. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening to our talk today. As you know, in this very strange year, it was not possible to host a physical exhibition at Welgemeend in Cape Town, but we are very privileged to have the opportunity, with the kind cooperation and hosting of Strauss and Co., to present to you and to keep the tradition of Welgemeend Month of Art alive, 4 Zoom sessions on topics related to Welgemeend and the art hosted at Welgemeend. Today is our first session, and we welcome Dr. Gera de Villiers, who is an art specialist and art historian, and she is going to tell us more today about Welgemeend. Thank you, Gera, for your time and the wonderful research that you've done and for sharing it with us. We hope that this will be not only relevant to our audience today, but that for many years to come, people will use this as a reference. And thank you very much for creating an awareness and for making Welgemeend and Welgemeend history and art history alive to all of us. Thank you to all that is working together to make these Zoom talks possible. This is our 7th year of the Welgemeend Art Month, and we are very proud to present Dr. Gera de Villiers in the first of our talks. Welcome to everyone.
I hope that you are as excited to learn about history today as I am to tell you. We are going to dive deep. I'm going to take you on a journey of many hundred years. Of course, I'm going to talk about the beautiful residents of Welgemeend, but let's begin first a few million years ago, because I would be remiss as a historian to not provide you with an inclusive understanding of the history of the area in which Welgemeend sits. So let's start in the pre-colonial. The prehistory and history of South Africa spans nearly the entire known existence of human beings and their ancestors. So that's, some 3 million years or more, which means that we have one of the longest sequences of human development in the world, and is why we can claim to be the birthplace of humankind. Within our soil are the fossils of hominids, who are our distant ancestors from millions of years ago. And many tools have also been found alongside of these fossils, which provide evidence of humans with increasing tool and social development in the earlier, middle, and late Stone Ages. And our modern history can be traced to more than 100,000 years ago, when the first modern humans lived in the region. And these were the ancestors of the San and the Khoikhoi peoples. So the San were hunter-gatherers, and they were those very first modern humans about 100,000 years ago. And the Khoikhoi are pastoralists who came to the Cape about 2,000 years ago. And these two groups, who are often referred together as Khoisan, they rendered the paintings found in many of the caves throughout this area of the country, as you can see here. And also, these were the inspiration, for our coat of arms. There's images on our coat of arms. And if you're in the Cape and you've never seen rock art, you must definitely prioritize a trip to the Cedarburg whenever it is that we're allowed again, because they have just an absolute wealth of beautiful rock art there. But so the Khoikhoi who lived in the Cape sought wild game, edible plants, and water, and they grazed their cattle in the Table Valley in the early summers. They traveled to Hout Bay in midsummer, and then they crossed the Cape Flats to Boerneef during the winter. And they lived like this until the settlers arrived. Okay, so about that. 1488, Bartholomew Dias sailed to the Cape of Good Hope. He was the first European to anchor in South Africa and the first one to round the tip of the continent. Then 1498, Vasco da Gama became the first to sail around the tip of Africa and onto Asia, which established a trade route that the Portuguese monopolized and which made them very rich. After about 100 years of this Portuguese monopoly, the Dutch had had enough, and they also wanted a piece of the pie. So on the 20th of March in 1602, a group of Dutch merchants and independent trading companies came together to form the VOC. So it was founded as a chartered company to trade with Asia, and this consequently took over the trade monopoly from Portugal. Interestingly, the VOC is regarded as the first transnational corporation because it had offices and employed people in Europe and Asia and Africa, and the first multinational enterprise to issue shares of stock to the public. There was a stock market in the 1600s, which is incredible to me. So the VOC was in fact an early model of a conglomerate company because it diversified into multiple commercial and industrial activities like international trade, shipbuilding, and the production of goods like spices, sugarcane, and of course, South African wine. It soon became clear that the company needed a pit stop on its trade routes to and from India. This station was conceived of as a refreshment and a refueling station, and also for ship repairs, for sailors to convalesce and rest, and for ship supplies to be replenished. So, a story we all know well, in 1652, the VOC sent Jan van Riebeeck to Cape Town to establish this station in the Table Valley area. Now, as you can see from this obviously modern picture that I've included here, the Table Valley is bounded by the shore of Table Bay, and it's naturally enclosed on all sides by Table Mountain, Devil's Peak, and Lion's Head, and Signal Hill. And, you know, it's basically what we refer to now as the City Bowl. So why Cape Town? Well, those same resources that I mentioned that the Khoi sought in the Cape, the wild game, the edible plants, the water, the grazing areas, were exactly those that made this area so appealing for the VOC to set up their station and to subsequently grow the colony. And what happened to the Khoisan? Well, much like European colonists worldwide, in order to advance the colony, the Dutch pushed aside the native people and claimed their ancestral lands for themselves. This unfortunately led to a lot of animosity and numerous violent clashes between the colonists and the Khoisan. And the settlers also spread disease and germs against which the Khoisan just didn't have immunity. So as a consequence of this warfare and this disease, it took a large toll on the Khoisan population. And sadly, in about 50 years, the Khoisan were pushed entirely out of the Cape Colony. You know, it was an area that they had been using for 2,000 years. So to further suit their needs, the settlers changed the landscape of the area. They introduced cultivation of the soil, which was, you know, the central purpose of their enterprise, and they also used water for both irrigation and as a source of mechanical energy. So it was intended that the company's garden would produce enough fruits and vegetables for victuallating ships. And victuallating is a great word that I recently learned, and it means a ship that is being resupplied. However, production did not quite meet demand. So in 1657, the company began to allot land to free burghers who would work the land and sell their surplus produce to the company. So free burghers are those people who, or men, who were not in the employment of the VOC. They were just regular citizens. And some of these burghers were granted garden allotments from 1 to 8 hectares in Table Valley. And these gradually spread fan-wise from the embryo of town, so say the Castle of Good Hope, upwards towards the mountain. And to assist in the cultivation of land and the production of goods, in 1657, the company decided to import slaves to work in both its own garden and the surrounding new farms to really help make the colony a successful enterprise. In 1658, the first large shipment of slaves arrived in the Cape on board the Amersfoort. And the Amersfoort was a Dutch ship that had actually captured a Portuguese slaver that was en route to Brazil from Angola. Now, the Amersfoort originally took 250 slaves from the slaver, but only about 170 survived the trip to the Cape, which is a sad and huge loss of life that was unfortunately not atypical in this business. So looking at this slave table, you can see that the slave population grew tremendously in the 1700s. Historian Robert Schell, who made this table, estimates that between 1652 and 1808, which is when the British ended the transatlantic slave trade, about 63,000 slaves had been imported into the Cape. And they were typically brought in from East Africa and Madagascar and the East Indies. And when they arrived in the Cape, they were either assigned to the VOC or they were sold to slave owners. And they were usually given new names, which is a common tactic used to further alienate them from their previous lives. So they were given European names like Anna or David, and surnames that noted where they were from, like van Bengal, van Madagascar, from Bombay, or even the month in which they arrived. And if a slave was born in the colony, they were given the surname van de Kaap. Often, we don't know what happened to specific slaves in the Cape Colony other than who they were owned by. But one way that we do have, one way that we do have information about them is through official or court documents, such as Rosa van de Kaap, who was a seamstress at Welgemeend during Stephanus Hofmeer's ownership in the early 1800s. And the reason that she was involved in a court document is because her son, Absalon, allegedly stole 2 horses from a neighboring farm to make the long journey from the area to visit his girlfriend in Wynberg. And he was subsequently caught and sentenced to public humiliation and 2 years in iron shackles on Robben Island. But Hofmeer actually sent a petition of mitigation to the governor at the time, in which he acknowledged the fairness of the punishment, but made his request for leniency in recognition of Absalon's earlier good behavior and on an urgent request of his elderly mother, a faithful slave. And that would have been Rosa. So this petition was accepted and his sentence was adapted that he could rather serve his owner for 2 years in iron shackles. Still not great for Absalon, but because he was in court, as I said, we have these documents and that has given us a small glimpse into his life. And then another notable slave associated with Welgemeend is Angela van Bengal. She is actually one of the most famous and prominent early slaves at the Cape. She was brought here with her companion Domingo and her 3 children as personal servants of the commander of the Amersfoort, who was Peter Kemp. And in the Cape, he actually sold Angela and her family to Jan van Riebeeck as personal household slaves. And then 5 years later, when van Riebeeck left the Cape, he sold Angela to Abraham Gemma, who, when he left the Cape in 1666, manumitted his favorite slave, Angela. And this made her the 3rd ever slave to be freed in the Cape. So 2 years after being freed, she made the full transition into Cape society by being baptized as a Christian. And then a year later, she married Arnoldus Besson, who was a wealthy freeburger. And they were married for 20 years. They had 6 children together, and they really built up their lives in the Cape Colony. And then in 1689, when Besson died, he left his widow a large inheritance, which she continued to add to. She actually doubled it in her lifetime. And he also left her property, which was Beltevreden, which was just across the street from Welgemeend. And the inheritance of this property made Angela, who was an ex-slave and a widow, in fact, the first woman to be granted land in the Cape in her own name, which is incredible. Okay, but so what is her connection to Welgemeend? Well, in 1699, her son, Gerrit, bought Welgemeend and owned the property for 2 years. And then less than 50 years later, her great-granddaughter, Sophia, and her husband, Michiel, lived at Welgemeend for 12 years. So there were many, many, many more slaves associated with Welgemeend, and we can find them mentioned in the property deeds, as many of them were sold with the property, or they're noted in the inventory of the estate when an owner died. But, you know, as mentioned, the specifics of their personal stories are few and far between, and that's why accounts such as these are so important, because they give just a slight glimpse into the lives of slaves during this time period. And the legacy of slaves survives to this day. Many Afrikaans words are derived from the Eastern languages spoken by slaves, like Pisang and Bredi and Spanspek. Slaves influenced the food that we eat and the way that foods are spiced, like curries and societies and koeksisters. Slaves built many of the old buildings, like the Castle of Good Hope, and many houses in the winelands. They were really the lifeblood of farms here and helped to establish the Table Valley area. Okay, so now that I've set the scene a little bit, in 1692 and 1693, a whole batch of Kloofneck Valley was portioned out into market garden allotments. So along with Leeuwenhof, which is the premier's house, Welgemeend was established as a property in 1693. And these two, along with Waterhof, which is just across from Leeuwenhof, are actually the only 3 surviving Table Valley farmsteads. On the 30th of August, 1693, which will be 327 years ago this month, the land that Welgemeend sits on was granted to Andries de Man. De Man was from Amsterdam. He belonged to an old aristocratic Dutch family who for a long time had been councillors of Delft, which was one of the chambers of the VOC. And this property, Welgemeend, consisted of about 4 morgen, which is apparently 3.5 hectares. And it was used as a market garden to produce fresh produce. So, vegetables, fruit, and meat for the passing ships. And this endeavor was aided by the fact that the property actually has a natural spring on it, which is still in use today. So it provided fresh water for the animals and gardens, and of course also the inhabitants. When De Man died in 1696, he left it to his widow, Elsie van Sierwaarde, and she sold Welgemeend a little bit later to move to what is now her namesake, Elsiesrivier. But in this sale of the house is where we get the first glimpse of what Welgemeend looked like, because the title deed mentions that there was a huis en schuur. You can see it here, huis en schuur. And while it was probably a small house with a thatched roof, there's no reason to think that this original house does not form part of the present homestead, even if it's just contributed to some sort of footprint of the house. In the first half of the 18th century, property in the gardens changed hands fairly frequently. As you can see, by 1700, Welgemeend had been owned by 7 people in the past 7 years that it had even been a property. And this was often because owners found that the agricultural possibilities were too restricted, and they sought more extensive farming further from town. So what happened was that the gardens area sort of became a testing ground for newly released company officials to see if they liked and were successful in farming. And then if they were, then they would move out of town to a larger property. In 1709, Michiel Ley bought the property, and he was from Basel, Switzerland, and had arrived as a soldier in 1698. He later became a butcher and was actually a sheep broker and one of 4 butchers who held the company's monopoly. Adam Tuss apparently bitterly described him as Michiel the Swiss beenhakker. And while he might not have been a pleasant man, his work made him quite wealthy. And this wealth was inherited by his wife, Engela Berdar, when he died. And in 1719, she died. And from this inventory is the second glimpse that we get of what Welgemeend was like in its early days. We can see that she and Michiel led quite a comfortable life. Welgemeend was actually their farmhouse, and they had another larger house in town, which is a bit laughable to think about now, given the size of Cape Town today. But so this inventory describes Welgemeend as having a larger room with a cellar under, 2 small rooms, a kitchen, a winery, slave house, wagon house, kraal. So it was a fairly substantial property. And it also had expensive furniture. They had framed pictures and ornaments, as well as a lot of silver and copper and porcelain. It's noted that they had 22 books and a Bible. They had bed linen and tablecloths and serviettes. They might have had 5 windows because 5 white curtains are mentioned, and they were attended to by 11 slaves. So in comparison to the inventory taken in the first transfer of the house in 1696, it seems that Michiel Ley was responsible for many new buildings and improvements to the property that he had acquired in 1709. And you can see that it doubled in value during his 10-year ownership. These are the prices here. And that he was proud enough of it because he named it. He named it Welgemeend, which means well-intentioned. So the colony during this time was thriving, and so were those who lived in the Upper Table Valley, as you can see, as they had close access to the port, and they managed to trade directly with the crews of passing ships, as well as supplying the townspeople daily with produce from their gardens. And I found this really nice quote by Otto Menzel, who was a German man who lived at the Cape between 1732 and 1741, and he described these activities. He said, "An account of the Cape inhabitants would not be complete without mentioning the vegetables and fruit gardeners. These gardens are situated outside the town, but in Table Valley, within the shadow of Table Mountain, more especially in the vicinity of Vlaggeman's Kloof, which is now Kloofneck. There the soil is good and water is plentiful. The streams that run down from the mountain are led by regular furrows to these gardens. In addition to vegetables, grapes are successfully cultivated because there is an abundance of sunshine, and the warm rays that concentrate on the slopes of the mountain cause the fruit to ripen well and early. The owners of those gardens dispose of their products by sending their slaves into town with baskets and supplying regular customers or casual buyers." So you can really get a sense of the beautiful, fruitful, fertile area of the Table Valley in this time. Okay. Now, in 1769, Welgemeend was bought by Bartholomew Bosch. Bosch was from Rotterdam and arrived in the Cape in 1751 as a sailor. In 1755, he married Maria Smuts, and in 1768, he became a free burgher and bought Welgemeend a year later. So it's noted that the price that he paid for Welgemeend was actually quite hefty, which leads one to believe that he was a quite wealthy man. Sadly, I guess, he died a year later, and Welgemeend became the property of Maria, his wife. In 1722, Maria married Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr, and this began the longest period of ownership for Welgemeend. The property stayed in the Hofmeyr family for 172 years, for 7 successive ownerships. So Hofmeyr was born in Lingen in Germany in 1721, and he came to the Cape in 1744. He and Maria were each other's third spouses. It's unclear how many children she brought to the marriage, but he brought 6, and they did not have any children together. He's described as a prodigiously energetic man who rose to be the director of the company's chief barn, which is the Grote Skier, which is now the presidential estate. And he's actually buried there, and his grave is protected by Rose's will. So here is a picture of the farms in this area in about 1778, when Hofmeyr, 1778, when Hofmeyr had owned Welgemeend for about 5 years. The depictions may not be very reliable, but Welgemeend is said to be shown as a thatched building surrounded by regular fields in front. I have to be honest with you, I don't know which one of these buildings is Welgemeend, but I trust the source that it is here somewhere. I'm sorry, I can't point it out. But the next reliable sighting of Welgemeend is 10 years later, near the end of Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr's management of the farm. In 1787, Colonel Gordon, a notable topographical artist, drew a panorama of the city bowl from the crow's nest of a ship anchored near the castle. So I'm assuming it's sort of something like what's happening here in the top left, those ships there. He was climbed up to the very top and then drew this panorama. And he must have had some sort of mechanical means of plotting the view because it's thought to be very reliable. So you can see that he shows Welgemeend here as 3 rather plain barns without central gables, and they are hardly comparable to the other houses in the area, such as Boerneef here and Bellevue up here. And as a complete aside, when I was looking into what Bellevue was, I saw that it's a 18th century house that was turned into St. John's Hostel, which was a refuge for boys orphaned during the First World War and the Spanish influenza of 1918, the last great pandemic, which I thought was interesting. Okay, but this depiction shows us that it seems that few dramatic improvements had been made to the building since Engelbert's time, when it, it had been documented as a house, a slave house, a wagon, etc. In 1789, Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr transferred the property to his son Johannes, who was his son from his first wife. And here's another map of the area from about 1804, which shows, here you can see the house and its neighbors. And by successive grants and purchases, Stephanus actually trebled its size throughout his 35-year ownership of the property. And you can see this in this map here. You can see here is the Welgemeend and the original 1693 grant. And then here is the 1811 grant, and then further the 1820 grant that he got. So, combined, these make up a massive property. And with the succession of owners, the house would have undergone several changes during its lifetime, but it's probable that a little bit of each iteration of the house survives today. Although it's really difficult to confirm just which parts are from where, because there's never been an extensive forensic study done of the house. But the building, the observable building fabric does give us some clues about when the house proper was built. And it's likely that it acquired this present look during Stephanus's time in the early 1800s. Because some of these features definitely date from them, because they are when English influences began to show themselves. So I'll just run through a couple of those examples here. So many Cape buildings have steep thatched roofs, often with gables, but you can see that Welgemeend has a very flat roof here. During the Dutch period, which was before the 1800s, front doors were of the stable door variety, where the upper and lower halves moved independently from each other and horizontally. But you can see here that these front doors are vertically opening. And its fanlight is oblong, with an elliptical tracery containing a flower-like motif, whereas in the Dutch homes, they usually had straight glazing bars with panes, much like that of windows. Actually, like these windows. And there are two windows on either side of the door, and they're actually pretty rare because they are of the Dutch pattern, like I mentioned, but actually have upper sashes which slide. So the top window, part of the window is not fixed, but can slide up and down, and that's a feature that was only introduced during the British period. And then you can see that Welgemeend has a very narrow entrance hall instead of a voorkamer. Now, we know that most unchanged Cape Dutch homes are characterized by their wide open and hospitable voorkamers, in which entering the home, you find yourself in the very heart of the house. But the English custom emphasized privacy and therefore disapproved of voorkamers. So gradually more and more homesteads of both English and Dutch owners were built or changed even to have these more private entrance passages. So this early 1800s appearance of the central part of the homestead really provides an interesting insight into the changing tastes of the time. All the features that I just described were about to become general practice during this period, but for some reason they occur actually quite early on here. So now here I'm showing some census records from this time, from 1800, 1805, and 1807, that show the growth of the property and of the family. So we can see that between 1800 and 1805, the vineyards increased by 25%, slave numbers increased by 15%, and the family grew and aged. And I found another great account of the area from 1822, which again talks about the prosperity of the market gardens, and it reveals that, you know, it's still the main activity in this area, and that not much had changed since Otto Menzel's account 90 years before. But this account that I'm going to read to you now is by a man fabulously named Wilberforce Bird. So he wrote, "The private gardens between Cape Town and the mountains, for which the inhabitants are plentifully supplied with fruits and legumes, are of exquisite beauty." He writes specifically of the gardens of Boerneef, which he said is what in England would be called a good estate, yielding to its owner ample means of living like a gentleman. The rents arise from the daily sale of every description of fruit and vegetables to the population of Cape Town. This is done to a great extent by slave boys who go with 2 large baskets twice a day, backwards and forwards, filled with whatever is seasonable from the garden, and with eggs and milk from the farm. From some gardens, 5 or 6 slaves are constantly so engaged, and at particular seasons will bring home 20 or 30 riksdollars per day. Apparently, a riksdollar is an English term for the silver coinage that was used in the Cape Colony, and from this account, we can assume that 20 or 30 riksdollars was quite a good sum of money. So again, so we can see that it's still a bustling, profitable area in the early 1800s. The third hofmeer in line to acquire Welgemeend was another Jan Hendrik, and he owned it for 38 years, from 1824 to 1862. And he made an important contribution to the Cape's architectural heritage because he actually sold off half of the estate. And much of it was turned into Cape Georgian houses that really typified the area in the mid-19th century. The time during which he owned the property was quite a tumultuous one. During his time, the period of prosperity in the Cape came to an end and was succeeded by one of political and economic uncertainty. And the following things contributed to this uncertainty. The Burgher Senate was abolished in 1827, slaves were emancipated in 1834, and there was a decline in the export of wine and agricultural products. And these all had implications for the garden owners of the upper Table Valley. However, luckily, Welgemeend survived, and perhaps that was the reason that he sold off so much of the ground, or maybe he did that because he was losing money. I'm not quite sure. But when he died in 1862, Welgemeend became the property of his son, who was, you guessed it, Jan Hendrik. This fourth owner of Welgemeend had 10 children, and one of whom was Onze Jan. Now, Onze Jan was born in and grew up at Welgemeend with his grandparents and lived with them there until their deaths. Now, he's one of the best remembered Afrikaner statesmen and politicians of the second half of the 19th century, and he acquired fame as the editor of the paper Ons Land. And he did obviously much more. But while he never owned the property, he lived there, he stayed there. Welgemeend, besides being a family and a social center, also became a hive of political activity, and many meetings were held here. And notable visitors would have included, Paul Kruger, Jan Smuts, Herzog, and even his own nephew, Jannie Hofmeyer, who was part of Smuts' cabinet. And another exciting visitor, or alleged visitor, who could have been there when Onze Jan was a child, was the intrepid explorer David Livingstone. In 1852, after his first trek along the Zambezi River, Livingstone came to Cape Town with his friend Oswald, and he wrote to his father-in-law after arriving in the Cape. He wrote, "Oswald and I soon got horses and searched the town for a house. We got one high up the ascent, which goes through between Lion's Head and Table Mountain. A Mr. Hofmeyer is the owner, and the house is pleasantly situated in a large garden." So, of course, we can assume that he was talking about Welgemeend, which I find terribly exciting. Okay, so the fifth owner of Welgemeend was Tielman, the younger brother of Onze Jan, and he owned the property from 1897 to 1914. And here are just some great photos, each spaced about 10 years apart. So this one's from 1890, and then 1900 and 1910. And you can see that, you know, the vineyards are there, the gardens are beautiful, that for some reason they changed this flat roof to have a steepled roof. I'm not quite sure why, but you know, it looked beautiful. And what an amazing setting with the Table Mountain in the background there. Another wave of suburbanization happened during this time. This map here on the right is from 1884, and it shows how sort of the layout of Cape Town at the time. So we can see the Castle of Good Hope here, and then all of the market gardens up here. And this demarcated area here is where Welgemeend is situated. And zooming in, actually, I've shown you here. So this is Welgemeend, and this is what it was like in 1884. And then I've just included this image here, this aerial image from 1926. I don't know how they got an aerial image in 1926, but luckily they did. And you can see that Tielman actually sold off the areas around Welgemeend, and he subdivided the property, and it turned into a grid of streets. So this is Welgemeend Street here, and then Stephen Street and Hofmeer Street, Lingen. That all wasn't obviously there in 1884, but just a few years later, it was. So the sixth owner was Tielman's nephew, Gijsbert, who owned the property from 1914 to 1938. And this was the first time that the house did not pass directly from father to son. Gijs was clerk of the Cape Assembly and later of the Union Parliament. He was the first administrator of New Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. And in 1916, with his approval, Sir David de Villiers Graff built a Cape Dutch gable to the side wing here. You can see in this image, it's a painting that is a photograph of a painting. So he had this gable built, and then he put up this plaque here. And I don't have a picture of it, but it went along with a bust of Onze Jan. And every single account I came across and read about this gable described it as being inappropriate or out of place or not authentic. So in the 1950s, this offensive gable was removed, and the flat roof that we know now was restored to that section of the house, luckily. So the seventh and last owner of Welgemeend was Harold, Gijs's son, who owned it from 1938 to 1944. And here's a lovely family picture of Gijs and his wife Edie and their children on the stoep of Welgemeend. And then this is Harold here at the back left. So now I'm going to show you a little video of Welgemeend. And the video is narrated by Babette, who was the granddaughter of Gijs, and she was born at Welgemeend in 1924. And this is an adorable picture of her as a child holding the train of the bride's veil. And I recognize that Zoom videos are not always great, but this one is too good not to share. So let me just get it up here.
Steps of the family,
think I must share it like so.
There we go. Thanks, Gera. Now we can
Sorry about that. I was just listening to this old-time music by myself.
see. Thank you.
I'm the eldest grandchild. Decided back to my grandparents. Soon after this house was expropriated. My lifetime had excluded and turned into This was the last time I saw my grandparents.
Okay, oopsies. Let me just put this back. Okay, so in that video, I just realized that you can beautifully see the offensive gable, and at the top there was the bust of Unsian. So what's great about doing, oh sorry, here's my reminder for the video. What's great about doing a project like this is that you get to hear from people who have a connection with the house and the family who live there. So last year when I was preparing this, this talk, I was lucky enough to meet a Hofmeyr descendant, and she shared these beautiful photos with me of her mother getting married at Welgemeend. And she sort of remembered well the beautiful stream and glen that ran next to the house. And that's actually, you can see here in this right-hand picture, we're in the glen where the wedding took place. And here I've just got a sort of a topographical or architectural map where you can see that the stream runs down through the property. And she was also baptized in the home, and along with all of her cousins, you can see here. And a few years ago, she was able to celebrate her 90th birthday here. And then a few days ago, I received another email from another Hofmeyr descendant whose grandmother was Trader Lowe, who was the niece and goddaughter of Onze Jan. So she was born in the home and actually lived there with her grandparents and Onze Jan for a time while she was studying at the Good Hope Seminary. And she also acted as a bit of a secretary for a time for Onze Jan. And you can see from this bottom picture here, she still has some of the clothing items that her grandparents wore on their wedding day. The top hat, the gloves, the silk tie, the silk handkerchief that her grandfather wore, and the stockings that her grandmother wore. And also some lovely silver calling cards here, or calling card holders from her grandparents. And she says that this was from a little exhibition that she put up at Welgemeend during the party for her 40th wedding anniversary. And she says that she was hoping to celebrate her 80th birthday there later this year, but alas, that's not going to happen. But it's really lovely to see that the house is still being used by the public, but also by the family who's has a deep connection to the property. And then just to bring us up to speed with what's happening to Welgemeend today, as you heard in the video, rather sadly, Welgemeend was acquired by the Cape Education Department in 1944 to become part of Jan van Riebeeck School, which had opened next door in 1926. And again, this was much to the heartbreak of the family, but I think that the property had just gotten too expensive and unruly to manage. And it's perhaps a good thing that the house was sold to such good caretakers, because as I mentioned, the only other Table Valley homesteads that survive are Lievenhof, which is the Premier's house, and Boerneef, which is a private residence. So they've been great caretakers. They actually, the school actually subdivided the house. That's what these maps are here. They subdivided the house into living and classroom areas, and the principal actually lived in part of the house for quite a long time, from 1945 until 2002, and then the rest was used as a art, music, cultural activities area. So in non-pandemic times, Welgemeend is a venue function, and as Lizelle said, and as Mia said at the beginning, it has been the venue for August Art Month for the last 7 years. And Art Month is aimed at creating awareness and promoting Welgemeend as a cultural gem. Through this month-long exhibition, it's a way to make private collections available to the public. So most importantly, it's a fundraising endeavor for the restoration and maintenance of the house. That has to date included lighting and electricity installations, damp proofing, painting, restoration of some artworks, restoring floors and windows, and all of last year's funding went towards redoing the roof. So each art month has a particular theme as decided upon by the main contributor and curators, Frank and Lizelle, and then they invite other private collectors to exhibit alongside of them. Last year's theme, which is what these pictures are from, was satire and irony, which focused on artists Robert Hodgins, Stanley Pinker, and Alexander Podlashuk. And there are other previous iterations have focused on South African women artists, abstraction, and so on. And I think that the last talk actually in this series is going to be them speaking about the exhibition that they've held here. But outside of August Art Month, Welgemeend displays the collection of the South African poet and linguist Boerneef, as the school received his amazing collection of paintings. There were 64 paintings that they got, that next week Wilhelm, I believe, will speak about, or in 2 weeks' time. And his library also was donated, because next week Amanda Boerta will speak to you about Boerneef. So I'm not going to elaborate further on him, but I do just want to end here with this great quote taken from the life of Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr of Onze Jan, which was published in 1913. So he wrote, "The lover of the antique will find much of interest in the old homestead, with its plastered walls, its flat roof, its windows with their small panes, its pergola and massy pillars in front, and the slave quarters at the back. Nor need one doubt that on its broad stoep many a pleasant hour was spent by the old burghers as they smoked their pipes and lost themselves in the magnificent view of the mountain and the sea and white plastered houses beneath them, and in the distance, the expanse of country stretching to the north." And standing on the stoep, which is where this picture was taken, you can imagine what it must have been like to look across open expanses of land and farmland, straight down to Table Bay and watch the sailboats sail around. And when everything is opened back up again, I really, in 5 years' time or whenever it happens, I do encourage you to come and visit this beautiful property and think about the full and rich life that it has led. Thank you.